Terry. I think I will take a drink of the water after singing. You know, your voice gets a little bit dry. I preach for about another 30 minutes, so. Well, it is good to be here with you this morning. And I had no idea you'd be doing Christmas songs this morning, so that's kind of special too. But this morning we're going to look at the parable of the prodigal son. And I know all of you, as most believers are, familiar with that. So, but I think we're going to really dive into the details a little bit more than perhaps you have at other times. So we're over in Luke chapter 15. It was an American playwright, the great Arthur Miller, who had said, in every successful drama, there's something which makes a person say, hey, that's me. In every successful drama, something that makes you pause and say, I relate to that character, or I relate to what's going on here. I imagine if I asked every one of you what your favorite movie is, or favorite book, and then asked you why, there would be something about it that's very relatable. Some reason that it's your favorite because you relate to something in it really strongly. And so it is with good plays, good books, good movies, even Jesus' parables. The reason that he gave his parables, they weren't just good stories, but they always drew people in. And I know it's kind of hard for us to do that because here we are, thousands of years removed, different setting, everything's different, so we see these details and we catch bits and pieces, but it's hard to really be drawn into a lot of things in Scripture because of that time and culture barrier that we have going on. So a lot of my role is really to try to remove that barrier so we can get into the text and see, oh, I see myself in this story in perhaps a few different ways. But no doubt that you've heard of the parable before of the prodigal son. You have a boy who's wandered off, an older brother who's jealous, and a loving father, a very loving father. And the way that these three interact is not really the way that anyone in the original audience would have supposed. They would have supposed that this story would turn out a whole lot differently than it did. But in each, if you look in Luke 15, I just want to give you a little bit of the context, but this is the third of three parables in the 15th chapter of Luke. So you have a parable of a lost coin, parable of lost sheep, and parable of a lost son. And what all of these are about, it's really the same theme. Something lost that's been found, and then great rejoicing. Sheep that have been lost and then are found, great rejoicing. Coin that's been lost, coin that's been found, great rejoicing. And here it is, a son that's been lost, a son that's found, great rejoicing. And so that theme is going over and over throughout this. So we really get that into our minds, that God rejoices over lost people that are found. Because that's not something that was readily believed at the time, and I think that's not really, we have a hard time with that even today. But Luke is just really beating that into our heads, that God rejoices over the lost who are found. And in fact, he says in here in verse 7, there will be more joy in heaven over 1,000,000 sinners who repent. Now he says just one. Over just one sinner that repents. And verse 10 says it again. There's more joy in heaven. There's joy before the angels of God over just one who repents. Just one. God going to great lengths for just one. Just one. And that's so different than, I think, our culture, because we look at this and we say, wow, I mean, we could get excited if we saw like a Billy Graham kind of revival where you have thousands of people coming and the whole town of Cerro Gordo is saved. And that would be exciting, don't get me wrong. However, we've kind of become conditioned to think big is always what we should celebrate, and small is insignificant. I ministered in the Capitol for 12 years, and I think there was only one lawmaker that came to Christ during that time. But that doesn't make it any less of a celebration than if 10,000 or all 177 lawmakers came to Christ. It's still, according to this text, God delights just as much in the fact that there's just one, and is found. So the Pharisees, they're the ones that are hearing these parables, and it's their original setting, And they would teach anyone, but never would they really stoop down to get into people's lives. They kept a distance. They didn't like to get too close. They would teach because they kind of had to. This is what we do. This is what we're paid to do. But they didn't really like to identify with the weak and the lowly. So they kept their distance. But Luke 15, we see something very different because we see the heart of God, that here's a God who's pursuing weak and lowly and lost and disgraced and sinful and ugly people. Very, very different than the Pharisee. And we'll pick that up in just a little bit when we get to the older son. But the details of all of this are familiar to us, and let's go ahead and dive in. So we'll look at verses 11 through 19 first, because those verses talk about, it's a long passage. The first few verses look at the son, the prodigal son himself. So verse 11 says, "There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the property that's coming to me.' And he divided the property between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had, and he took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate. And no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I'll arise, I'll go to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son, so treat me as one of your hired servants.' So we read about this young man who wanted nothing to do with his dad. We don't know why. We don't know why he hated him so much, but it really borders on hatred. We don't really have a shame and honor kind of culture in America, but we get a sense of this. If your child came to you and said, 'Dad, I wish that you were dead,' you get a sense of how shameful that is and how hurtful that is. And that's what this young man's saying to his dad. 'Dad, give me my inheritance. You're in the way. I wish you were dead. Give me what's going to be mine. Just die already.' And the dad gives it to him, which is the first of many twists in this parable, but he just gives it to him. A boy demanding that kind of thing in this culture could have been taken out back and beaten publicly. Now, that's abusive behavior, but that's what would pass for allowable parenting in this culture. But that's not what the dad did. It said, instead of beating his son or scolding him publicly, he takes and gives him the inheritance. It's completely selfish what this young man's doing. It's completely hard-hearted, spiteful, hateful, shameful. And the dad gives him what's his. Now, if you were to think about that, if you're leaving an inheritance for your children, it's not as if you can just give it to them, just write them a check and off they go. You probably have property. And so it is in this case. The father has great property. So what he does, he says, well, okay, this is going to be yours. The older son would get 2/3 of inheritance. The younger son would get 1/3. So this is the younger son. He's getting his 1/3. But the text says in verses 12 and 13, he received he received what was his, and not many days later gathered all that he had. In other words, he's selling everything off for the cheap, selling it off as cheaply as he can to get out of town. If you're given a house that's worth, we'll say, $500,000, and you say, I don't care how much it's worth, I need to sell it and just get out of here. You might get $200,000 for it, because if you want to sell it tomorrow. He didn't care. He didn't care what anything's worth. I just want cash, and I want to get out of this town as quickly as I can. I hate everyone here. I hate my dad. I hate my older brother. I hate everyone here. I just want to get out of all of it. And so that's what he does. The boy headed, Jesus says, to a far-off country. This is a way of saying that he went to live among the Gentiles. He didn't want to be among Jewish people who are going to judge him and say, you need to keep the law, and you need to worship this way, and he doesn't want anything to do with it. Doesn't want anything to do with his family. He's cutting all ties to family, all ties to friends, all ties to God and religion. Everything that he knows, he's throwing in the trash, burning it up, and leaving. And why does he do this? Well, verse 13 is very clear. He does this so he can indulge in a manner of reckless living. Reckless living. I don't have to be too detailed about what that is, but just the extreme excesses of sin. Anything that he can use money to get, he's using money to get. So the boy threw all of his money to the wind, and as always happens, if you don't have a plan, disaster strikes. Just a given. The book of Job says that man is born to trouble as surely as sparks fly upward. You are going to have trouble, and you need to make plans because it's coming. And this boy threw all caution to the wind, spent all of his money on sinful living, and disaster strikes by way of famine. He has no food, he has no money, and so he decides to hire himself out to a farmer, a Gentile farmer, and he's just going to feed pigs. And it's not even just feeding pigs. He's exploited by this farmer because the farmer's not even paying him enough to buy bread. He's being exploited. He's being abused by this Gentile farmer who knows here's this boy who's on the verge of dying. He'll do anything I tell him as long as I keep him from dying. So sure, you can go eat the slop that you're feeding to the pigs if that'll keep you alive. And so that's what the boy does. I've been to pig farms before. It's pretty gross. And eating pig food takes a special kind of desperation to get down there with pigs and you're eating their food because you're so hungry. I think one thing that this parable, it just shows us to the point is that I think it's true to say that sin didn't bring life and freedom to this boy. Sin enslaved him. It tricked him. He really thought life was going to get bigger. Life was going to be better. That my dad's just holding me back. Real joy. Real joy is out there doing what the Gentiles are doing and being sinful and really living it up and drinking and smoking and everything else we can do. And his older brother says the younger brother hung out with prostitutes even. And so we have everything going on here. And he thought this was going to be real life. This was where it's really to be had. And my dad he's been keeping this joy from me. And he finds the very opposite is what's true. To this point, he finds this is just absolute misery. He is completely destitute in his sin. There's nothing that he can do. He's living in an unclean land with unclean animals, eating unclean food with an unclean farmer. Everything about this is just really revolting to a Jewish audience. Even to us, it's pretty revolting what he's put himself in. Sin doesn't expand joy, but always remember that it reduces it. So I don't know what you're tempted by this morning, but each of us are in different ways. And whatever you're tempted by, I think that's one thing that this text reminds us of is sin is not going to bring joy. Whatever it is, it might be that, I just want to tell somebody a little bit of gossip. Sin is not going to bring joy. If it dishonors the Lord, it is not going to result in the good things you're hoping it achieves. If it's theft, if it's lying, if it's slander, if it's adultery, whatever it might be, it is not going to produce joy. It may start out feeling good, it's not going to end there. And that's what it is with this son. It doesn't end where he thought it was going to end. So as we step away, just consider what Jesus' audience would have thought, because the Pharisees, and they taught the people very much about earning your way. You had to make things right. So those listening, they might have expected Jesus just to end the story here and have some lesson about reaping and sowing. That, the boy, he reaped a life of rebellion, and he's getting what he deserves. That's right, Jesus, preach it. He's getting what he deserves. And that's not where Jesus ends the parable. The Lord continued, but when the prodigal came to himself, verse 17, hunger and shame awoke the boy to this reality that he's not living real life. He's hit rock bottom, and it can't get much worse. So he goes home, and you imagine he's planning what he's going to say to his dad, what's going to happen, and what his first words are going to be, and what life is going to be like. But he says, I don't care what happens. I don't care what my punishment is, I'm going home. It was much better than what. So we look at the loving father, verses 20 through 24. It says, "And the boy, he arose and he came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, 'Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm not worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quickly, bring the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand, shoes on his feet. Bring the fattened calf, kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and he's alive again. He was lost and he's found.' And they began to celebrate." That is not at all what the Pharisees expected was going to happen here. But it did. The rabbis taught that reconciliation could only occur through restitution. So however bad your sin was is how good you have to be to make the scales equalize. They taught that in terms of God, that you've sinned, and so you've got to do enough good to outweigh your sin if you're going to be good in God's sight. And that's why they called some people sinners, because they're beyond doing enough good in this life. They're condemned. Don't even bother trying, you're condemned. So when it came to this, they're thinking the same thing, that home ought to be a life of humiliation and hard labor for this boy. And it ought to be until his father dies, and even after the father dies, he probably should continue working in service to his older brother now to try to make things right, to restore the family name. But Jesus said the father was looking for the boy. That is to say, he sees him, he's looking, and he sees him still far off. That's to say, not that he just happened to go to the kitchen window, he looks out, and oh, hey, there's Johnny. He keeps looking, and he keeps going back. And you think that this is probably the behavior that he's doing, not just once a day even, or once a week, but he's doing this throughout the day. He keeps looking and keeps looking and keeps looking, hoping that his son would come home. And then he sees he's far off in the distance. And he sees him and runs out to welcome him. That's what he's been waiting for. He hasn't been waiting for his son to come home so he can beat him and shame him. He's been waiting for this moment when his son comes home and he can welcome him back into the family as a whole different boy. The father felt compassion. That was his chief emotion, as he felt compassion. Not anger, not bitterness and spite, and for all the things that his son had done wrong, but compassion. And that is the emotion that God most feels when sinners come to him. It isn't, okay, you've got to earn this, and you've messed up so bad, this is going to be hanging over you now for life and eternity. Compassion. Compassion. Emotions were a sign of weakness in the eyes of the Pharisees. I don't know if you knew that, but honorable men didn't cry. They didn't weep. They didn't show emotion. They had a certain, they really had a certain poker face, from what I understand, that you acted a certain way because they are godly men. They are holy men. And so they acted a certain way. And they even had a certain walk that's described by the rabbis, a certain way that holy men walked. It's funny because when I was in the political arena, I heard some people say this is the way politicians walk. And it wasn't a joke. They were being serious, that there's a certain way that you walk. You walk slow and dignified. You swing your arms out. I'm serious. And it's the same thing with the Pharisees. You walk a certain way. You have a certain face. You play the game a certain way. In fact, honorable men didn't even run. They had, longer robes, and so if you're going to run, you had to lift that up a little bit to run. You didn't show the ankle. You didn't show the shin or the calf. You didn't show those kinds of things. There was a certain way that you had to conduct yourself in public. And what is this father? Abandons all social protocol and just runs. He sees his boy, feels compassion, is overwhelmed with emotion, and runs to see him, though he looks like a complete fool to everyone in the town. Completely indecent is what they saw this as. But the dad was looking for the boy, and by running and embracing and kissing his son, he's saying, "You are still mine." He's identifying with him. I don't care what you've gone through and what kind of things you've done to the family, and you're mine. You're still my boy. And that's how he treats him and draws him in, and hugging him and embracing him. And people are seeing this. He didn't want this to be a private thing. It's very public. He wants everybody to see this, what he's doing. Because he knew that when his son comes home, he's going to have to walk through a gauntlet of criticism. He's going to walk through the town. People are going to see him. Old friends are going to see him. Old family members. People are going to look at him, and they're going to start throwing verbal stones at him. And so the father says, we're going to walk into town together. Verse 21, just the boy's response, he can't imagine this. And it keeps getting better. The grace keeps being lavished upon him. But he says, Father, I've sinned. I've sinned against heaven. I'm not worthy to be called your son. It's like, Dad, what are you doing? I don't deserve this. I don't deserve any of this. Why are you doing this to? Why are you acting this way? I've sinned all the way to heaven and back. I don't deserve this. I deserve hard labor. I deserve a beating. I deserve all of these other things. And the father's response, he doesn't even address him. It's not as if he explains. He just immediately goes on and says, go get the fattened calf, get my ring, get the robe. It's like he doesn't even care what the boy's concern is. It's just, he just dismisses it because he's so excited that his boys come home. There would be no punishment. There would be no penance. There, not even a word spoken about the past, because this wasn't even the same boy. His son left hating all things to do with his dad, and he comes home and is a very different young man. The prodigal to make things right with his dad, and his dad made everything right. His dad did everything to make it right. Servants were ordered, get the sandals, get the ring, get my best robe. Only those with authority wore sandals, and the ring was a sign of authority. And the robe was a sign of identity. You belonged to this family. It was dignity. And none of this would have made any sense to Jesus' audience. In fact, I think, from what I know about the Pharisees, this probably was irritating at this point. Is this father ever going to do anything right? Is he ever going to beat his son? Is he ever going to make him earn anything? Does this boy just get off scotch-free? You can imagine the Pharisees just really boiling with hatred at this story. What's wrong with this guy? And the reason that I think they would have thought that is because they didn't know the heart of God. They couldn't imagine that here's a God who delights to save sinners, that actually likes to be with weak, lowly people, that likes to pursue them, that you can't out-sin his grace. Could the Pharisees, but you can't out-sin God's grace. Emotion. He actually has compassion when people come to him in faith and repentance. They didn't imagine a God like that. They imagined a God that says you have to earn it. If you're going to be in my kingdom, you've got to earn it. So shape up, get it together, act right, you've got to earn it. And here's Jesus teaching the exact opposite. You don't earn it. So look at the older brother, verses 25 through 32. It says, now his older son was in the field, and he came and drew near to the house. He heard music and dancing. Music and dancing. And he called one of the servants, and he asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father's killed the fattened calf because he's received him back safe and sound. But the older son was angry, and he refused to go in. So his father came out to him, and he entreated him. But he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you kill the fattened calf for him? And he said to him, son, you're always with me. All that's mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad. For this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and he's found. The celebration was lavish. The fattened calf, it was slaughtered. Guests were invited. Music's filling the halls. There's dancing and celebration. But traditionally, that calf, that would have gone to the older brother for his wedding. And so he's burning with anger. That's my calf, and you just slaughtered my calf for that son of yours. He doesn't even call him his brother or mention him by name. It's just that son who's just a black sheep in the family. That son, you slaughtered my calf. This was supposed to be my calf, my party, with my friends, and what do? You do all of this for him, Dad. What's wrong with you? On the day of the prodigal return home, it's interesting, the older brother wasn't to be found. It's the older brother, he was out in the field working, and that sounds virtuous. He's out there doing things, but it's not meant to be virtuous at all. The fact is, he didn't care much about, he didn't love his father. Because if he loved his dad, where was he throughout all of these other events? The older son was nowhere to be found. He should have tried to keep his younger brother from leaving, pleaded with him. He's not there. He should have tried to protect Dad's honor. He's nowhere to be found. He should have been part of the celebration when the son returned, and he didn't even know what was going on. I mean, it takes a while to invite a lot of guests and get something this big together, right? He didn't even know what was going on. He's nowhere to be found. He's working. He's industrious. He's earning his father's favor. He knows he's getting 2/3 of the inheritance, and he's going to earn it. The older brother's enraged. He won't even set foot in the house. You notice that. It says that called the servants. The servants, he's asking what all these things meant. They explain. And it says that he was angry and refused to go in the house, and so his father had to come out to him. This is backward, and it just shows us the level of hatred he had for his dad, just the contempt that his dad would act this way. He's bitter, and he says, look, I never talked to my own dad that way. Even when I was a kid, my dad and I, we would get into a lot of fights, but I don't think I ever said to my dad, look. Like, I mean, we get a sense of that, what's going on here. In this shame and honor kind of culture, multiply it by 10. You don't talk to your parents that way. Look, Dad. Look, these many years I've served you, and yet you never gave me a young goat, but this son of yours, you killed a fattened calf for him. I worked hard, and he received. And that's the attitude of the Pharisees. We work hard. We've been part of this all our lives. We've been pursuing and trying to understand the Torah and teaching it and serving faithfully. And you mean to tell me that tax collectors and prostitutes are going to be saved? You mean to tell me people who have done nothing, they're going to get into the kingdom, but we who've done all of this for you, God, we're not getting in? And that's exactly what Jesus is saying. Because the older son is a picture of the Pharisees. And if you're reading, you read that last verse. The father says, this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. And I had always wondered what happens next. You know, the story, it just ends. And it's really a literary device because the ending's implied. It's not as if it's not as if Luke lost a fragment of the text or something happened or Jesus didn't finish the story because he didn't finish it because it's implied. You know how it ends. What did the Pharisees do to Jesus? They murdered him. What do you think this older brother does to his father who comes out to the field to see him? I wish that when he came out to the field that the story ended with and the older brother came to his senses and decided to go inside and celebrate with his younger brother. But I think it ends much differently than that. The implied ending is that the older brother put up his fists and beat his father to death. That's how it ends. That's the implied ending. Grace after grace was offered by Jesus to people all throughout Israel, and the Pharisees hated it. And so what did they do? They killed him. They couldn't imagine that there would be a God that's like this, that this is who God is. In every successful drama, as I said before, there's something which makes us say, that's me. And we all can, and if you're saved, you can obviously relate to the prodigal. You've gone off. Some of you maybe have gone off farther. You've come back. Maybe even in your Christian walk, you've had times that have been really cold and you've wandered from the Lord. You've come back. And so we can all relate to the prodigal. We see ourselves in it. But what about the older son? Because that's really who Jesus wants us to draw our attention to. Kind of this idea that, God, you owe me. And if you've ever felt like that, that's the older son. That's even Jonah, but it's the older son. God, you owe me. God, I've served you for so many years. Why are you blessing so-and-so who isn't even saved? God, I've been in the church all these years doing this and that and this, and I've given to you, and I've given a lot to you, and why are you not giving back to me? God, you owe me. That's exactly the heart of the Pharisee and the older son. God, you owe me. I'm entitled to your grace because of what I've done. And this story really confronts us and says, God doesn't owe you anything. It's grace upon grace upon grace, and he graces who he delights to grace. And we who know him ought to be thankful that God is like that. God is not a God who says, I'm excited when there's millions of people who come to know me, and I'm not going to get excited until there's millions. And I get excited when, the high and the mighty, when they come to know me, and celebrities, and our God isn't like that. And you see that in the person of Jesus Christ, because all throughout the Gospels, who do you identify with? There's only a couple of times you see him identifying with wealthy people. Just a few. But without those exceptions, it's always the weak and the lowly and the despised and despicable, those who have been shamed and abused and hurt and cast aside, that those who were diseased and sick. Those were the people he always went after. And so he says in this chapter in Luke 15 that God rejoices over just one that comes to him. And if we're really to have the heart of God, that's the kind of heart that we should have. Thankful for whatever grace we've received, and we rejoice when his grace is being poured out to others. Not begrudging, not saying, but you owe me, not feeling entitled, not like the older son. So with that, let me close our time in prayer before Terry comes up. Father, thank you for this text. It's convicting in many ways. And I thank you for the opportunity to be here in Cerro Gordo today. So I thank you for Terry, and I pray that you would continue to bless he and Marcia and just watch over them, give them joy this Christmas with family, and continue to watch over this church and the believers that are here. Thank you for giving me the chance just to be with them today and to fellowship. Pray that you would bless us as we go our different ways in a little bit. And we ask that in your name, amen.
Thank you, Shaun. Kind of convicting. It's what we need. We need to be presented from the gospel our needs. And I knew when I asked Shaun to come that that's what he would do. Let's stand and let's sing this final song, Angels from the Realm.